As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect, and joining me today, once again, I am super excited to be in conversation with our guest, not least because, as we know, the academy can often be a hellhole in which people write about subjects like decolonization, but have been silent when those material realities need to be spoken about, out of fear of job security, etc. So it's always a breath of fresh air when you are in conversation and in community with scholars who are deeply principled. So it's an honor and privilege to have you on the show. Welcome, Professor Nina Farnia. How are you?
Thank you very much, Mamadou. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on your show. And congratulations on your victory.
Thank you very much. And once again, thank you for all the support that you showed and everyone around the world, honestly. As I said, this is, again, tensions are high in the academy, in the world. And I don't want to make it about the academy, actually. The academy is just one site of struggle. And I don't think it's even the most important site of struggle. But I think as thinkers, intellectuals who are thinking about this current moment, theorizing about this current moment, and trying to have an analysis that can help those, the wretched of the earth, quote for none. I guess my question to you then is, what is your assessment of our current moment, and particularly from the perspective of those of us who exist within the imperial core?
So basically, I'm going to provide sort of an answer that seems, negative or pessimistic, and then I'll explain why it's actually a positive response. The United States in particular, but the United States and its orbit, they're facing a massive political and economic crisis. It's a crisis. It's generated by the crisis of capital, and the reflections of that are horrible wealth and income inequality, economic inequality, austerity measures that have been in place for decades that have destroyed whatever modicum of a welfare state existed, which means there's no social safety net to address the inequality, to protect people against the inequality. And then a crisis of overproduction, which Prabhat Patnaik has talked about a lot and written about. The crisis of overproduction and really all of these other problems are endemic to capitalism. And they've been around for many, many years, for decades. But U.S. imperialism has always mitigated the effects of the crisis of capital. Now, things are changing. And so U.S. imperialism is less and less able to mitigate these effects. So I'll just explain quickly or briefly. Historically, the way that U.S. imperialism has mitigated the effects of the crisis of capital is through three primary mechanisms: the dollar dominance, or printing of the dollar, sanctions, and warfare. All of these mechanisms rely on imperialism and the functionality of the empire, but each of them is facing a serious problem that results from basically global resistance to U.S. imperialism. I'll start with, I guess, the biggest one, warfare. So this has always been a big one for the U.S. in terms of addressing its own crises. Ali Kadri's written about it. Max Eil has written about it. Other folks that you and I are friends with and read have talked about this. One of the ways in which warfare mitigates the crisis of capital is through the arms industry. U.S. companies manufacture weapons, sell them to, this is an oversimplified story version of it, but U.S. companies manufacture weapons, sell them to Israel and Ukraine and other junior partners and proxies at exorbitant prices. These countries basically function as U.S. empire's mercenaries. Now, if you look at the returns, the rate of return for these companies, the major aerospace and defense companies in the U.S., right now, GE Aerospace, which produces engines and other parts, 75% rate of return. Raytheon, which is actually facing some production problems, 50% rate of return. Lockheed Martin, 20% rate of return. Howmet Aerospace, which produces parts, almost 90% rate of return. Axon, which creates tasers and body cameras and things like that, 70% rate of return.
Wow.
So the impact, the role that these companies play in US capitalism is extraordinary. The problem is that the world is unifying against these wars and recognizes that the US uses endless warfare as a capital accumulation strategy. And I think this is actually the greatest challenge for anti-imperialism, is how to deal with this phenomenon of endless US war. But there are a few things that are certain. The first is that the US can no longer produce as rapidly or as effectively and efficiently as other countries throughout. It's like right now, it's like on the edge of producing as rapidly and efficiently as other countries throughout the world. It just doesn't have the academic fundamentals to do it. And if you look at, I'm a legal scholar, so if you look at the amicus briefs in the anti-affirmative action case against Harvard, SFFA versus Harvard, the amicus briefs are filed by defense manufacturers and the top universities in STEM and the sciences. And they all say, the military officials, they all say, we cannot compete. The US cannot compete at a global scale, either politically, militarily, or economically, if we do away with affirmative action. So it's clear that the US recognizes that it has a problem when it comes to competing militarily. The second point that I made, I think, was sanctions.
Mm-hmm.
So the US has always used sanctions to address its crises, especially the crises of overproduction. So, for example, by sanctioning Iran and Venezuela so severely, it's effectively removed two of the largest energy sectors from the global market. But and I'll say, like, sanctions pose a huge problem for, like, people, for the Iranian public or the Venezuelan public and communities around the world. It's posed a major problem. But this is also backfiring. The global South nations, and I think we just sort of watched this unfold at the political level this week at BRICS, the global South nations are formulating mechanisms to bypass the sanctions. They're trading with one another. Russia this week proposed the BRICS pay mechanism, which would effectively replace the SWIFT system for international, not replace, but almost replace the SWIFT system for international transactions and enable trade in local currencies. So the identifying mechanisms to bypass sanctions and to create sanctions-free zones, economic and trade zones, is at the forefront of the minds of the global South nations, and they're actively doing it. And then the dollar dominance and dollar diplomacy and things like that. So dollar dominance has always been used to address the problems that income inequality and economic inequality create for the US public. And what
Mm-hmm.
the US does effectively is print more money and to encourage spending when it faces crises. This is what happened during the pandemic. I mean, it's been very recently. It also happened during the 2008, 2009 economic crisis. So it also lowers interest rates. But because de-dollarization is sort of on the horizon and happening, as again was discussed this week at BRICS, this is not going to be as effective as it was in the past. So what happens is that it causes inflation, right? And we've experienced massive inflation in the United States. Inflation enables price gouging. All this exacerbates economic inequality. The wealthy hold on to their money rather than invest it, which also contributes to the crisis of capital. So this is what we've been seeing in the US. But at the global scale, de-dollarization means that the dollar is not as valuable as it used to be. And so even printing money is not going to be as effective as it used to be as addressing the various crises of capitalism. So that's sort of the economic picture, I think, put simply.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that assessment. But yeah, to carry on, please.
No, I was just going to say, so politically, this has consequences. And I'll say this briefly. So the election is in 2 weeks. Hopefully we'll survive the the crazy media storm that we're all facing. Everybody's talking about Trump and Project 2025 and this and that, and they view Trump as sort of like a fringe manifestation. The Heritage Foundation, which is the think tank that issued Project 2025, it's some sort of fringe political, whatever, lunatic arm of US politics. That's not entirely true. So if you look at the board of trustees of the Heritage Foundation, that they're like the leading American capitalists. They're civil libertarians, they're rightward leaning, but like one of the biggest funders of Heritage Foundation has historically have been the heirs of the Mellon dynasty. And so these are, by American standards, by mainstream American standards, they are respectable figures. They're not some sort of fringe lunatic arm of American society. This is a direct response to the crisis of capital, because as inequality increases and racial tension increases, they need to advance repression in the United States. And in order to do that, they just have to change their approach. And so like today in the New York Times, I think it's in the New York Times or Washington Post, there was an article about Trump sending out troops, military troops on US soil. He's said over and over again that he's willing to do it. Many presidents have done it historically. And I have an article that's coming out about this, I think at the beginning of the summer. But this is not like fringe politics. This is all about addressing the crisis of capital that is worsened by the end of US imperialism, the fall of US imperialism.
Thank you so much for that assessment. And I think any revolutionary project needs revolutionary theory. So I appreciate the clarity in which you address that. So, pulling together so many different threads that you mentioned BRICS, you mentioned the election, which we're going to go into speak about and assess further and discuss. Okay, so many of us were watching BRICS this weekend, and we are seeing the clips juxtaposed for all the Western leaders who said that Putin is isolated. Russia is isolated, but we've seen how ineffective the sanctions were on Russia, and we're seeing greater South-South, third world collaborations emerging. I read some parts of the Kazan Declaration, and it was fascinating. I wanted to see particularly how they spoke about the Middle East, how they spoke about Palestine, and again they mentioned the things about going forward with de-dollarization, etc. So I guess my question is, given that we're seeing the crisis of capital in the global north, and we're seeing as a dialectical opposite to that the emergence of greater global south cooperation and greater cooperation from states who are typically either maligned or have been subject to US sanction regimes, how are you thinking about BRICS, and what are some of your takeaways for what you saw?
I think it's a very exciting development. As several of them said in their speeches, the new world is not just upon us, it's alive. And so I agree. So I do think that they have some problems to address as they grow. This is any institution is going to face problems as it grows, especially. And so I think those problems need to be addressed. There's a membership challenge, right? Like Brazil and Lula blocked Venezuela's entry, which is ridiculous, both problematic, right? And just on the facts, it's ridiculous. And so I think problems like that need to be addressed, dealing with the social democrats that sort of position themselves as progressive or whatever, but then really have buckle in the face of US imperialism. That problem needs to be addressed by BRICS, I think, at some point in some way. There's also the problems of countries like UAE, which UAE is what it's doing in Sudan, what it's doing in Palestine. It cannot be trusted. Egypt is the same. Modi from India is a problem. So there are sort of clear enemies of the people that are among now the official BRICS nations. That problem, I think, needs to be addressed. I think the biggest challenge that BRICS is facing, and they're taking it on head on, is the economic challenge of creating this alternative system. But they're handling that. I think also related to all this is, right now BRICS is focused on building including countries that are sort of economic or political powerhouses or strong for whatever reason, right? Which is why Egypt is there. It's why UAE is there and all that. But there are also many victims of US imperialism that are increasingly joining the resistance or have historically been on the front lines of the resistance, like Haiti, there are uprisings in Martinique now, the island of Kanaki, which people call New Caledonia. These island nations in the Caribbean and Pacific regions have been strongholds of US imperialism. And I think BRICS needs to figure out how to deal with or integrate these places into its broader approach. On the other hand, those are the challenges and the questions that I think remain. On the other hand, and I think my hope is that they're going to figure all this out. I'm sure they're aware of it. If you read through the diplo speak, right, the diplomatic speak, what you see is that they are done with international institutions right now. They're done with the UN. They're done with, the international economic framework. And they are serious about disrupting US global dominance. That process, I think that like the cat is out of the bag. And I don't think that process can be turned around. What they orchestrated over the weekend, and it wasn't, I mean, Putin obviously had a major role to play, Putin and Russia, but I think China had a major role to play too. It was a media coup. I mean, watching these nations come together and the head of the UN show up and then basically get attacked over and over again. It was a complete media coup, a mainstream media coup, and it was remarkable. I think the only thing that could potentially disrupt this sort of global South rising project is something like what happened during the era of the Sino-Soviet split. But the Sino-Soviet split, basically, I mean, it took 50 years or so for it to, or it took decades for it to really destroy the global socialist project. But it really hurt the global socialist project and the non-aligned project, the Sino-Soviet split. It doesn't look like that's on the horizon or that anybody could effectively effectuate it because the US doesn't have the economic fundamentals to effectuate that split. It's too embattled militarily. And frankly, everybody increasingly hates the US. Even Americans, they're unwilling to go to war for it. People around the world are beginning to see beyond Hollywood and fast food and whatever to see the US for what it is. And this empire, like all empires, is dying. So the US that effectuated the Sino-Soviet split during the Cold War and then won the Cold War is not the same US is not the US of today. And on the other hand, China and Russia are now much stronger than they were before. So I think, like I said, BRICS has challenges, but I think it's very, very exciting. I think it's very exciting.
I appreciate that. And I think those of us who identify US imperialism as the primary contradiction are definitely seeing the developments and looking at them fondly because, again, we're talking about spaces of autonomy, right? Like what China allows and Russia and what BRICS allows for is the creation of spaces of autonomy for countries to reclaim sovereignty and chart a new path forward. And I think that should be welcomed by anyone who calls himself an anti-imperialist. I know some questions that people will have, and I think it's worth discussing, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. How about the point that, okay, so what is the project, right? We don't seem to be at the time in which countries were attempting to export global revolution or export socialism, particularly, or socialist path forward. And I understand that for any socialist path, the first fundamental is sovereignty, right? The ownership of the means of productions and the ability for people to be in charge of their land in order to chart a path forward. I think what people do say about BRICS though, and I don't know, people have some fair critiques and maybe not other some reactionary critiques. So I'd love to hear your thoughts when people say, okay, but what is the project here? Yes, we understand the kind of, in the Samira main term, the delinking from the US being fundamental. But if it's not a project, an explicit project, let's say of like socialism, for example, how do we assess that and how do we interact with things like BRICS?
So the BRICS project is a multipolar project or multilateral project. That's basically what it boils down to. And so the idea is what we saw over the weekend, for during the week, for better or for worse, is that nations sit at the table as equals and make decisions as equals. The BRICS nation, part of, they're not, the BRICS nations have a pact that they're not going to invade one another. They've made all kinds of agreements to build equality, political equality. So that's the project. As to your question about, well, if it's not socialist, then should we really support it? And you're asking it because that's the sort of a critique that's people always make.
It's not my view. I'm just kidding. I'm asking it by, I'm a proxy here.
Yeah. No, exactly. But you know what? Like, it's a ridiculous question. It's a really ridiculous question. So what? So you are okay. So we should tell nations like Venezuela or Haiti or whatever, right? Like, okay, no. You know what? It's better to be exploited. It's better to be illiterate, to not have access to medicine during a global pandemic when you could produce your own, or Cuba produced its own vaccines but didn't have the parts of the syringe to administer the vaccines. Okay, so we tell people, I mean, Cuba is socialist, but Iran is not. Whatever, we tell them, you know what, it's okay, capitalism is eventually going to work for you. I think we've learned it's not. I think we've learned over the last 500 years, 600 years, that imperialism, colonialism, and capitalism are designed to destroy us. They're designed to destroy our people and destroy our nations. And so, in order for people who are genuinely committed socialists, I think this argument is a straw man argument. I don't think it's a legitimate argument. But for people who are genuine socialists, who are just repeating this argument because they don't know better, in order to effectuate socialism, you need sovereignty. You have to have sovereignty, and you have to have self-reliance. Your people have to be able to feed themselves and to survive just on a day-to-day basis in order to build a truly socialist state and a socialist world. So to the extent that the BRICS project is advancing an anti-imperialist position, we should support it. To the extent that the BRICS project is advancing fundamental sovereignty, political sovereignty, economic sovereignty, we should support it. Is it imperfect? Yes, everything is imperfect. There is nothing that's perfect. None of us is perfect. No institution is perfect. But I can tell you for sure that the imperfections of BRICS right now are better for our countries and our people than the genocide in Palestine, or I think it looks like a genocide in Ukraine that was caused by the US and Europe and NATO. These arguments are ridiculous. They're idealist arguments that are not based in reality. And the reality is that in order for us to be free, we have to end US imperialism.
Thank you so much. Absolutely in agreement, and a mic drop moment. And thank you. I think it's important that we push back against these narratives that have become unfortunately popular and coming from factions and sectors of, I guess, the broad left, or people who ascribe themselves to the left, from, quite frankly, from people who should know better, actually. So thank you for that response. So given that this is our current context, we have an assessment of the crisis of capital, which is heightening its contradictions. We have an emerging project of Global South cooperation. So now, what role do we have? And again, it's very difficult. I know there are many paths in the struggle, and people struggle upon different registers. But I guess, how do we fit into this? Particularly those of us who live within the imperial core. What is our role?
I think, you and I are both in academia, although I think you and I both identify as activists, outside of academia as well. I think we have to wage resistance and advance the struggle for freedom, for economic and political freedom, wherever we're at, wherever we're located. And anybody can do that. Anybody can do that. We're in a genocidal moment now. there have been many genocides, US sponsored and US led genocides throughout modern history. I mean, that's really what my book, I mean, like I've been going through a lot of archival documents as I finish my book. I'm right now finishing my chapters on Nicaragua, and the Contra War in Nicaragua, which was led by the US in the 80s, it was horrific. It was horrific. And so genocide is not new to the US. It's certainly not new to the white world order proffered by Europe initially. But what's different now is that we're actually watching it unfold. We're watching people burned alive, as we saw 2 weeks ago. We're watching bulldozers drive over bodies, human beings that are alive. There's so much more that can be said about what we're watching, and so we have to resist. There's no other path. There's no other path. We can't allow this to continue, because if it continues, today it's Palestine and Lebanon. Tomorrow it'll be somebody else, and then somebody else. And as technology advances, it's going to get worse. It's not going to get better. It's only going to get worse. It has gotten worse over time, and it will continue unless we stop it. So I think that we should embrace all forms of resistance, whether it's the student encampments or labor coming out against the genocide and in support of Palestine, or people waging resistance in the region. I think we should embrace all forms of resistance. And ultimately, the only thing that will stop this war machine is the resistance. And I mean resistance broadly. I mean to include all the tactics that are at our disposal to end the murder of our people. My husband is Palestinian. His family has lost almost 100 people in Gaza. Almost 100 people. I think the number is in the 90s. Mostly his cousins.
Wow.
It's whole family lines. There were 2 specific bombings in the early days after October. 2 specific bombings killed whole family lines. It's just and this is just our family. So we can't allow this to continue. We just can't. And this white world order that is hell-bent on killing us for profit, it's got to end. So, we have to be nimble in our resistance. We have to be aware of what is happening. We have to objectively monitor the conditions at every given moment. Sometimes, like we need to step back. Sometimes we need to step up, right? We have to be nimble. We have to be thoughtful. We have to be strategic. All those things that everybody has known and done for generations. But we have to continue. We have no choice.
No, absolutely. And I think, yeah, the images that we're seeing, it's almost, we have such a vast literature of like colonial violence, so it shouldn't shock us. But there's something about like the first live stream genocide that just has a different like resonance. And the fact that it's been going on for a year is yeah, it's just, I never thought I'd see something like that, honestly, and continue to see something like that. And I think this is a time where we have to absolutely embrace several forms of resistance. So thank you for that. Okay, so I'm going to switch to kind of questions that we had in mind around, and I'll come back to pro-Palestinian advocacy. But I think given that you've mentioned resistance, and we realize that the greatest burden to bear has been the resistance factions and groups that exist in the region, particularly in Palestine, Gaza, and in Lebanon. But I think the question many people have and worry about is, we saw, for example, right, the kind of gotcha phrase in the immediacy of October the 7th was, well, do you condemn Hamas, right? And that was a kind of gotcha phrase, and that was like the precursor before anyone was allowed to have an opinion, or before anyone was allowed to have a say or advance a pro-Palestinian position. It was like that had to be the fault line, right? And I think given that so many of these groups, and I think it's worth mentioning that these groups are proscribed or designated as terrorist groups by, to be honest, the Western world. A lot of countries in the global south don't see them as such, right? But given that we are in the West, and it can bring about a level of precarity, how do we engage with the legitimate struggle, resistance, And again, we know that armed resistance against occupation is an enshrined right by the United Nations. But how do we engage with these groups? And that's by engage, I just mean literally by talking about them. How can we talk about them whilst protecting ourselves?
I mean, so I'm not provide. I want to preface this by saying that this is not legal advice, right? But if you look at the law, it's coordination that is dangerous, that is unlawful. And so supporting the resistance rhetorically, right? Like supporting any resistance rhetorically is an international right, as you just said. It's also according to the United Nations, peoples under occupation and apartheid have the right to resist. So I think that it's important, notwithstanding the limits of I mean, I just sort of like talked about the problems of the United Nations and what the BRICS folks said about the UN and stuff. But if you look like historically at anti-imperialist struggles around the world, and I'll talk again about Nicaragua because that's what I'm writing right now. Nicaragua used, knowing the limitations of the law, Nicaragua used the law not to defeat US imperialism, right? But to generate public support for their struggle against US imperialism. They filed a big case in the ICJ. They won that case. They are I think the winningest nation in the world at the ICJ. And they won their revolution basically twice. They won once in 1979 and then they won again after the Contra War ended. So I think we have to use, like I said earlier, all the tools at our disposal to legitimize the position. I mean, it's basically a legitimate position now around the world, even in the US, right? Like nobody really, except for the Zionists and the capitalists, question the legitimacy of people defending themselves in the face of violence, right? Like you can't, like, what are you supposed to do when a bulldozer is running over your children? Let them run over your children? Like, how does that work? So I think we should just use all the tools at our disposal to legitimize anti-imperialism and to end US imperialism. And that's it.
Thank you so much. It really is that simple. It really is that simple. Okay, so given that the state mobilizes in particular ways to repress pro Palestinian speech, what do you think it is about the Palestinian question that elicits such a response from our institutions?
So I think there are a couple of important factors here. The first, which I mentioned earlier, is that Israel is a US mercenary state. It's, what it's doing in Palestine now is not new. Palestine has been subject to genocide for many, many years. It was a slow genocide before that accelerated at key moments, but then went back to being a sort of slow genocide. Now it's an accelerated genocide. What we're seeing is an accelerated genocide. But Israel was like a big supporter of the apartheid regime in South Africa. It was a big supporter of the Contra War. And by supporter, I don't mean like a cheerleader on the sidelines. I mean like training and money, and arms. It was a big supporter of the Contra War in Nicaragua. It is waging war right now in the Sudan. It has done everything it possibly can to, like, disrupt Iranian sovereignty. So it is basically a U.S. mercenary, right? The U.S. gives it tons of money, tons of weapons, et cetera, to do the dirtiest of the dirty work that the U.S. does. So that's one of the reasons why the US goes to great lengths and the establishment here goes to great lengths to protect Israel. It is why Kamala Harris refuses to denounce Israel or renounce Israel or be critical of it in any meaningful way. And the idea that if she wins, and I think it's a big if, right? But the idea that if she wins, she's going to do anything meaningful to end the genocide is ridiculous. That is not going to happen. She has told everybody that, but I digress. So the other key factor is what I talked about earlier, which is the centrality of warfare to U.S. capital. The arms industry in the US undergirds US capitalism, and they've basically done so since FDR. FDR sort of mobilized the whole economy. It was called total war. He mobilized the whole economy to support the war effort during World War II. And if you recall, the students of history, of US history in particular, will remember that Eisenhower, this is no revolutionary or radical, right? We're talking about Eisenhower. When he left office in the early 60s, he critiqued the fact that the US economy had become beholden to, quote unquote, the military industrial complex. He actually said that the conjunction of the military establishment and the arms industry is new in the American experience, and it has grave implications. This is Eisenhower. And what we're witnessing right now are those grave implications. So when the students rise up on their campuses and do these encampments and whatever, take over buildings or do protests, demanding that their institutions divest, this is not some sort of student hot-headedness or idealism. That demand to divest actually goes at the heart of US capitalism. Because our institutions of higher education, especially the elite ones, the most elite universities, there is no way that their investment portfolios are not connected to the arms industry. We know that, especially when the rate of return for these companies is 75-80% on a yearly basis. So there's a racial dimension to it, which I haven't talked about a lot, but the economic dimension is very, very serious. The US is not going to succumb to the pro-Palestinian movement, not unless it is forced.
Absolutely. And I think that's a brilliant segue to my final question. The US election. I have heard ad nauseum, this is the election of the lifetime. And, and I think there's such a disingenuous engagement and assessment and talking points that come from, liberals are always disingenuous because you scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds, right? But I think what's even more, quite frankly, annoying from people who should know better and say, well, what about X group? Their rights won't be protected. And normally they point to women's rights or queer rights as a way of justifying their kind of vote for Kamala Harris, right? To stop a Trump presidency. The job is to stop a Trump presidency, nothing else. And again, this is clearly coming from sections of our societies in which politics only happens every 4 years. But why I find it to be such a disingenuous engagement, particularly, is because why is it whenever the Democrats are in power first, they are hamstrung. It's about reaching the other aisle. It's about putting a Republican in Democratic cabinets. It's about ensuring bipartisan support, right? But when Republicans are in power, they're omnipotent. Trump had 4 years and elected 3 Supreme Court justices. RBG's body was barely cold before Trump was ready to move in with the help of Mitch McConnell, right? So this whole thing of Democrats are hamstrung, you can't do so much. But when Republicans are in power, they're omnipotent and they're all powerful and they can enact so many like serious, long lasting effects on this country, right? So I just don't buy it. And then given that people say, oh, but I seldom name call on this program. I do it on Twitter, right? But I tell them I don't do it on this program that much. But I'm gonna say it. Like Mehdi Hassan his argument is literally saying that Kamala Harris's presidency will mean less people dying in Gaza than the Trump presidency. That has become his talking point now. And the people say you can't be a single issue voter. Kamala Harris explicitly said in her town hall, right, with Anderson Cooper, yes, people are horrified at the images coming out of Gaza. But I also know these people also care about the price of groceries. And then people then say, oh, but you can't be a single issue voter. And I've never thought someone would say, like, single issue voter is like Medicaid, right? Or like gun legislation, right? Or like budget for schools and curriculums. I don't think a genocide is a single issue voter because it's not. First and foremost, Palestine converges and collapses so many issues, but it's fundamentally about the world we want to live in. Are we cool with rubbishing every single international institution, ignoring every semblance or any proclamation of international law because of one country wants to protect, one US wants to protect its colony? Because at the end of the day, Biden is to the right of someone like fucking Reagan. when it comes to Israel, and to the right of Thatcher when it comes to Israel, right? So, sorry, I'm very impassioned. I just get so frustrated. But all that to say, what do you think of the election?
I shouldn't be shocked. I should not be shocked. There should be nothing shocking about this, but I still am. That people have actually duped themselves into believing that conditions will become better than they are now with a Kamala Harris presidency. And the reason that it's most shocking now is because Kamala Harris is in office, right? She is the vice
Exactly.
president. And so, I mean, this is just, this is superficial. There's no deep thinking required to get to this conclusion, right? She is in office, in the administration, leading the genocide, okay? She is in office, leading the administration that can influence grocery prices. She is in office leading the administration that can deal with any of the other myriad problems that the people of the world and the people of this country face. And not only have things not gotten better since she came into office, they have worsened. All of our rights, our civil rights, our political rights have declined. Economically, our lives have declined. There's nothing like, so I it's just, I don't know. I'm shocked that people are making this argument as if she's some sort of like, a special figure that came out of the blue, and she's going to fix so much or be better than Trump. I They both have, what they share is their commitment to resolving or mitigating the effects of the crisis of capital in the United States. They share that commitment. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party share that commitment. They have different approaches to dealing with it, but they share that commitment. And so the two of them may have different approaches around how they deal with the crisis of capital, but neither of them is going to end the genocide in Palestine. Neither of them is going to end the war in Ukraine. Neither of them. And eventually, when these two wars end, and they will end, other wars will pop up. The US will create other war fronts in order to accumulate more capital and attempt to maintain the
Absolutely.
empire.
And I think that's it, honestly. Like, I don't think much needs to be said other than that.
Yeah.
And I think that is an honest engagement with the US electoral system, particularly with these candidates that we have. Particularly. And I think I'm sorry, like I've been saying this, and this for me fundamentally goes at the heart of American exceptionalism, that no, maybe like we might have to suffer a little bit for the world to be a better place. Maybe we have to sacrifice a little bit for the world to be a better place. Maybe punishing Kamala Harris is the good thing, right thing to do. But I don't want to make too much about the elections. I can't vote in this country, so. Finally, then, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's always a pleasure being in conversation with you. Final conversation. You've mentioned your book a couple times. Can we get a sneak preview? What is it about? What can we expect? When can we get it? I know sometimes asking people when the book is coming out is a very touchy subject, but 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 what is it about? What can we expect?
So it's currently called Imperialism: An American Story, though I think we're probably going to change the title. But it's really about U.S. imperialism and anti-imperialism. And so there are 4 parts, 8 chapters in 4 parts. The first 2 chapters are about Black communism in the early days of the Cold War. The next 2 chapters are about the American Indian movement. The third grouping of chapters are about Nicaragua and the Contra Wars. And then the last 2 chapters are about the pro-Palestinian struggle in the United States and the US response to it, both historically and today. So I'm really using these case studies of anti-imperialist resistors and activists to understand what US imperialism is, what it's done throughout the world, and why it needs to end. And I think the publisher wants the book to come out ASAP. So I think they're shooting for a December, or not December, a late 2025 issue date, a release date. but it might slip to early 2026. Yeah. So
And I am definitely excited, and I'm sure so many
thank you.
will be as well. Thank you once again, Nina. It's been a
Thank you,
great
Momodu. And again,
conversation.
Momodu, I'm so happy that you won your struggle, that you stood your ground. I'm proud of you. I'm happy to stand with you and be your colleague. And I can't wait to see what you do next.
Thank you so much, and a heartfelt thank you for all the support you showed me on both occasions, actually. So thank you.
My
Take
pleasure.
care.
My pleasure.